Thank you very much, Olga. First of all, I will not be presenting only my ideas, but ideas of all the authors of the paper, which is a joint work of the Slovak Foreign Policy Association, IPA, the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Europeum, the Prague Institute for European Policy, and Polish-Ukrainian Institute, PAUCI. It is a real privilege for me to sit here with such special people. Why special? Because it's Friday evening. We are in one of the greatest cities of the world, and instead of walking its streets, we are going to debate something that doesn't even exist, the European foreign policy, right?
It's raining.
Okay, it's raining.
It's too early to go to bar.
Well, you're from Slovakia, so you know. Anyway, in the previous panels, you're from Hungary. In the previous panels, we might have got the impression that the Central and Eastern Europeans are really obsessed by Russia. Because as Tatiana rightly mentioned in the previous panel, I mean, there was not 1 minute without mentioning the word Russia. So let us bring to our attention also other countries in the world in this panel, and namely Middle East, South America, and let's a little bit move away only from Russia-focused debate. We do not have time for a paper presentation. I was told that the audience didn't see the paper. I'm really sorry, this is it. We will send it. We will send it by email, of course, because one of the purposes of this whole event is that we want to receive your comments. So what we basically did was we looked at what the EU is, what it wants to be, and how can it improve its foreign policy to be really able to achieve its goals. We started with the premises that the EU really is an inspiring entity. It has capacity to assist other countries, also beyond the European continent, with creation of better governed states, more open, more democratic societies, but the EU is not using all of its potential, and it's not always able to exercise its strategic interests. At the same time, you have new players, new poles of attraction emerging around the world, which are in some areas becoming more successful than the EU. So we asked what makes them interesting, what can the EU learn from their strategies, and how can it amend its foreign policy to keep up with the power and soft power projections of these emerging poles. We didn't map everything, every new emerging entity. We picked some case studies, the three of them, Russia, Turkey, and Brazil. And we looked at two concrete issues where we tried to model their approaches, their motivations. Why Russia? Okay, it's the usual suspect, especially in the European continent and in the European neighborhood. It's perceived by some as the EU competitor, by some as a potential collaborator, by some as a threat. Turkey has also very special relations with the European Union. The accession negotiations are running at their own very special pace. It is also a country which is relevant not only regionally, but also globally. Given the neighborhood where it is, it has a say, and it has to have a say, on issues that are important globally. So this is how we should also take Turkey as a global player. And why Brazil? Why not China or India or South Africa? Well, first of all, there is lots written about China, India, and South Africa. Second of all, recently, a few months before drafting of this paper, Brazil showed very strongly and very loudly that it is willing to exercise its influence, whether successfully, that's another issue, also beyond its region. A South American country wants to have a say on Middle Eastern conflicts. And third reason why we picked Brazil. At the moment, you have a number of players who are trying to, or who are talking about changing the current global governance, about making a new world order. Yes, you have Mr. Ahmadinejad, Mr. Medvedev, Mr. Chavez, and many others. Brazil, and it was not just during the period of Lula da Silva, but also for the previous maybe 15 years, has been constantly rising, gaining importance, but its rhetoric is not divisive, or at least not as divisive and dividing as the rhetoric of the previously mentioned challengers of the current world order. We looked at the strategies these three countries are exercising in the case of Southern Caucasus and in the case of Iranian nuclear conflict. And now to skip briefly to our conclusions, I will mention in this opening statement only the most general ones and the most important ones. And I have to tell you that when we were drafting this paper, sometimes, and we knew that we are doing, as EU citizens, we are doing recommendations for EU policymakers. Not everything that is happening in the world depends on the EU, of course. There are many other factors. But we feel that for us it is legitimate to give recommendations not to Russia, not to Turkey, not to Brazil, but to EU. And sometimes in drafting these recommendations we had this feeling that giving recommendations to EU is a situation very similar to a conversation between a doctor and a patient with cirrhosis, who comes to the doctor and asks him, what should I do? And the doctor says, yeah, stop drinking. And the patient says, yeah, but that's what you told me last time. Do you have something more creative? No, I mean, many of the things you are going to hear now, you have read. We all write them. But for some reason, they don't seem to be having an impact on the EU policymakers. So we have to be more creative than the doctor in our previous analogy. What we think has to happen, and we are afraid is not going to happen so soon, is four things. One, the European Union has to have bold foreign policy strategy for mid-term, for long-term, and it has to have its annual foreign policy audit. What did we do this year? How did it help us to fulfill the priorities? How it didn't help us? You have cases like the Cyprus conflict, where everyone knows for years where is the problem. All the think tanks are writing the same thing. The EU claims to want it to have resolved, but yet not all the mechanisms are being used, just to give an example. So, priorities and audit. Second major thing. We have to do more to prevent our foreign policy goals or our foreign policy in general being hijacked by domestic policy concerns or by domestic policy per se in the member states. You know what is the main problem in the negotiations about trade with the countries of the global south? The farmers in the European Union. It's a domestic policy. We know what is the one of main problems why the European public opinion is negative regarding Turkey's accession. Again, xenophobic nationalist rhetoric at home. What you say in Berlin, what you say in Bratislava, what you say in Budapest is a foreign policy. You do not have to go out to say it, because people are watching what the EU leaders are doing also at home. It was already mentioned in the previous panels that the debates on domestic migration and unresolved migration problems are a very important foreign policy message that the EU is sending to the world. Third thing that we need to do is to strengthen foreign policy making not only towards governments but also towards people. The notorious example, of course, is visa liberalization. I have never been to a foreign policy conference where we wouldn't talk about visa liberalization, so that's how just be brief. I mean, do we in the European Union expect that people in our neighborhoods will start embracing the European norms just by watching the EU on National Geographic? No, they have to be allowed to come in. In many cases, we can get inspiration from our friends, the United States. Work and travel program has enabled hundreds of thousands of people from Central and Eastern Europe to know a different kind of life, for example. And then there is another thing where we maybe shouldn't get inspired from the United States, but try it our own way. Iran, where all political dialogue is being blocked until the nuclear issue gets resolved. And it doesn't seem to be moving anywhere too far at the moment. But at the same time, we don't have the feeling that the EU is exercising enough confidence-building measures with the Iranian society, which brings us to the last point, our fourth major recommendation, which is the EU has to do more for building trust. Trust, not an esoteric concept. We didn't just come back from Himalayas, and we do not want everyone to sing love, peace, and throw away the guns. No, but we have to become aware of the fact that what we sometimes tend to dream in the EU or think in the EU, and you find it in all the EU documents on the websites, that the EU is a positive player, a positive entity, a nice guy. This is not. In all the countries in the world, this perception is very different for many reasons. A, historical reasons. Let's not pretend colonialism never happened. It did. And if the people in the Middle East, in the South America, in many other countries, have trust issue with the EU, it of course is legitimate. And the EU policies have to take this into account. If we want to see in the world less forces, less political forces, movements, organizations who try to capitalize on the mistakes that the European countries and the EU itself has done in the past, if we want to stop this growing north and south and east and west gap growing, we have to take the trust issue seriously. Many of you saw it yesterday on PASOS Assembly. PASOS is an organization that brings together think tanks from Central and Eastern Europe and also Central Asia. If all of us go for a trip to the real Western Europe, we are all treated as Easterners. But what we saw yesterday in some of our conversations, we have our own East-West gap, because some of those Easterners already became Westerners, and it creates some communication problems. And this might be more dangerous than the real weapons. So let me stop here. Thank you.